voices bouncing around in our heads too. Well, today I hear the voice of Paul saying, the greatest of these is love. You know what? Communication between people is a pretty risky thing. Communication between people is often a very difficult thing. We are all aware of the fact, because of experiences we've had in our own lives, when a person is trying to communicate something to you, and what they're trying to communicate is not what you're hearing, concept of what happened. And so communication can be very, very risky and difficult. However, if you are trying to receive communication from someone in writing, you have an even bigger problem. Because
go ahead.
Can you start over?
No.
No, I'm not going to start over. I'm just going to say this, that if we are trying to receive communication from someone in writing, it is even more difficult because we don't have facial expressions, we don't have body language, we don't have voice inflections, those kind of things. So written communication is even more difficult, and we sometimes get even further off base with that. Now you add to that a couple more problems. Let's say that the person trying to communicate to you in writing is from an entirely different culture that you're not familiar with. Well, that complicates things even further because you are not familiar with some of the expressions and some of the things they're saying. It gets worse. What if that other person speaks a foreign language that you don't understand? Well, that's even worse because now you've got the problem of trying to translate words which have different meanings in different languages. The problem can get even worse. What if the person from this other culture who speaks a different language, who is trying to communicate something to you in writing, lived 2,000 years ago? Well, you know what? It's a miracle that we end up understanding anything, it's almost. And this is one of the problems that we have with Paul's wonderful, wonderful chapter 13 in 1 Corinthians, the so-called love chapter. To try and prove my point, this is kind of humorous stuff, but I'm trying to prove a point that we have a problem in communication. I have a group of young people from junior high school, and they have been exposed to a lesson in history or whatever, and then they've been asked to write a paper on what they heard. And these are examples of what they've heard. They are taken from essays and themes. One student wrote this: the inhabitants of ancient Egypt were called mummies. They lived in the Sahara Desert and traveled by Camelot. Not really true. That's what the kid heard. Another gave this answer on a Bible quiz: Jacob was a man in the Bible who stole his brother's birthmark. One student said the Greeks had myths. A myth is a female moth. Still another wrote this: Socrates was a famous Greek teacher who went around giving people advice. They killed him. Socrates died from an overdose of wedlock. One student gave this definition: history calls people Romans because they never stayed in one place for very long. Nero was a cruel tyranny who would torture his poor subjects by playing the fiddle to them. And listen to this one: William Tell shot an arrow through an apple while standing on his son's head. Or how about this one? Gravity was invented by Isaac Walton. It is chiefly noticeable in the autumn when the apples are falling off the tree. One student of American history gave this description of Benjamin Franklin: Benjamin Franklin had gone to Boston carrying all his clothes in his pocket and a loaf of bread under each arm. He invented electricity by rubbing cats backwards and declared a horse divided against itself cannot stop.
Oh.
Franklin died in 1790 and is still dead.
Okay.
And finally, another student had this to say about Abraham Lincoln. He was born in a log cabin, which he built with his own hands. Well, you know, we listen to these classic youngsters' misunderstandings, and we get very confusing messages about what they heard. They fall way short of the real truth, although each one has some bits of truth in it, you know, and they end up with a totally incoherent answer. It's like learning a little something but not quite getting it right, and we end up missing the main point. Well, this is the reason I've gone through all of this is because we want to make sure that as we go through the 13th chapter of Corinthians here, that we really hear what Paul is saying, that we don't get confused and end up making some kind of childish misinterpretation of what he is saying here. Very important to know exactly what he means and what he meant. So let's take a closer look at the situation that confronts Paul here as he's writing chapter 13. He had founded the church at Corinth, okay, and he had about 50 A.D. And he had stayed with the folks there for about 18 months. And then he moved on to start work in Ephesus. And he kept, once he got to Ephesus, he kept getting concerning reports about things that were going on in the Corinthian church, troubles that were starting to take place there. Now, as long as he had been at Corinth, everything had gone just peachy. There weren't any problems. But when he left, all kinds of problems started to happen. Conflicts, cliques within the church family, divisions, dissensions, party strife, power struggles. The church there was being literally torn apart. There was jealousy and self-righteousness and greed and hostility and arrogance. All of this in the church? Are you serious? We don't have that kind of thing in the church today, do we? No. All of this in the name of Christianity. And so here's the answer. The Corinthians had gotten a pretty good dose or a taste of Christianity, but they had completely missed the main point, the big point. They were playing around the edges, but they were missing the main message. And so Paul says to them, all right, look here, folks. This is what it's all about. You want to know the bottom line, the key to life? Well, let me explain very simply and plainly. And he writes the 13th chapter of Corinthians. Now, let's make sure we have our focus in the right place here. Paul is not writing this chapter specifically to describe the relationship between just two people. It's not meant specifically to describe the relationship between a man and his wife, or between a parent and a child, or between lovers, or between friends. What he's doing here, he is saying, this is what Christian love is all about. If you are a Christian, this is the way you should express yourself and the way you should behave in your relationships with all people. That's what this Christian love is all about. So as long as we keep that focus on this, it'll help us to work our way through this. Okay.
Brian, then why is this so popular
Because
at
people
weddings?
like it.
At weddings. No, I know, but it is a real popular thing at weddings. Is it
Sure.
because somebody decided that didn't really know what was going on? I mean,
No.
I don't think it's not right for weddings, but it's definitely not for just...
Right. The main focus Paul had was for Christian love as in our relationships with all people. But you can take any human relationship and apply these to it, and it makes sense. I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't, but that wasn't what he was primarily interested in doing. So, he starts out, and he says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames but have not love, I gain nothing. In other words, Paul says, you can have any of the spiritual gifts, any of the gifts of the Spirit, 1, 2, or more. And if you practice those gifts without love, it is useless and meaningless and can even be harmful. In order for those gifts of the Spirit to be useful and meaningful, you have to practice them with love. So he says, for example, if you have the gift of tongues, he says it doesn't amount to any more than a clanging cymbal or a trumpet blast. In other words, just a big noise. And by the way, that was typical of heathen worship in those days. Lots of noise and confusion and shouting, running around. So he says, if you have the gift of tongues and you don't have any love, it's useless. It means nothing. If you have the gift of prophecy, which we know to be preaching, okay, it can be more damaging than positive if it isn't accompanied by love. What about the preacher who spends the entire sermon dangling folks over the flames of hell? Okay? He even gives you the impression that he would rejoice in their damnation as much as their salvation, you know. That is a perversion.
The
Yeah.
best example I can think of that is if you're taking care of your aged mother and you're resentful and you show it. That's what pops into my mind.
Or don't
That's a
show
good
it
example.
and just let it
'Cause I've been there.
burn and yell and
Well, you know,
Inside.
what it amounts to in that case, it's all threat. There's no love in that. There's no love in that at all. All you're doing is threatening a person, trying to scare the dickens out of them, and that's not going to save anybody. Paul says you can have the gift of intellectual knowledge, but if you don't have love, that becomes intellectual snobbery. Right? You can even develop the spirit of contempt for those persons who are less intellectual, less well-educated, aren't quite as brilliant or well-read as you are. And so without love, the gifts of intellectual knowledge can become damaging and hurtful. You may have the gift of passionate faith, but without love, faith can be a very cruel thing. There's a man who was told by his doctor that his heart was not in very good shape and that he was going to have to take some time off and rest. So the man called his employer. Now his employer was a noted Christian, church-going, God-fearing person. And he told him, he said, I've got a heart problem and I'm not going to be able to make it to work for some time. This Christian man said, well, I have an inner strength through Christ that enables me to carry on.
Oh, that's very, very compassionate.
You know, that's, you know, you can argue that that's an example of faith. I mean, you know, there's no doubt about that. But it's faith without love, and therefore very hurtful and very harmful. You can practice charity and give generously to the poor, Paul says. But there isn't anything in the world more humiliating than charity without love. The person gives because it's a grim duty. Well, I'll get my 10% in there, and by golly, I'll have to do it one way or another. It's even done sometimes in contempt, like you would take scraps and throw them to a dog. You know? And even worse, while you're throwing these scraps to the dogs, the Gentiles, doing so with a smug moral lecture or rebuke. You know, what a terrible thing that is. Because that becomes nothing more than pride. It's not love, it's pride. Paul says you can even give your body to be burned, or we could say tortured, crucified. This is the kind of a Christian that would court or even encourage martyrdom and persecution only for the reason of putting themselves on display and making it appear that they're a hero in the eyes of everybody else. That's another matter of pride. So a sacrificial deed has to be based upon devotion and committed with humble love in order for it to be of any value. So Paul says, you know, you can have all these gifts, but if you don't have love. Now remember, he's speaking to the Corinthians, who at the time are having all kinds of fighting and bickering and arguing and everything going on. Then Paul goes on to say, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. 15 characteristics of Christian love. But we need to take a closer look at the meaning behind each one of those things to understand with clarity what Paul is really saying before we pull a junior high school blooper in our understanding here. First of all, Paul starts out, he says, love is patient. The Greek word that Paul used for patience is makrothumine, which is a word used only to express patience with people. It has nothing to do with patience with circumstances or situations. Paul is not saying, you know, you got to be patient and wait, eventually things will work out. He's not saying that. This expresses patience specifically only with a person. And even more specifically, it's used of the person who has been wronged and who has it easily within their power to take vengeance, but they don't do it. It also carries the meaning slow to anger. So you see that the meaning of the word patience, as Paul understood it and was trying to convey it, is a little bit different than the way we normally hear it. What it means altogether when you consider that translation, patience is a real strength in a person. Good old Barclay. Fosdick points out that no one treated Abraham Lincoln with more contempt than did Stanton. He called him a low, cunning clown. He nicknamed Lincoln the original gorilla. And he said that he was a fool, DeChalu was a fool to wander about Africa trying to capture a gorilla when he could have found one so easily at Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln said nothing. He made Stanton his war minister because he was the best man for the job. And he treated him with every courtesy. The years wore on. The night came when the assassin's bullet killed Lincoln in the theater. And in the little room to which the president's body was taken stood that same Stanton. And looking down on Lincoln's silent face, he said through his tears, "There lies the greatest ruler of men the world has ever seen." That's the patience of love, which in the end conquers. And that's the kind of patience that Paul is talking about. Love is kind. There is a better word to use in translating that. The word is sweet. Love is sweet to all. It's the opposite of what many Christians, religious Christians, are. You know, some Christians who are very, very devout, who are very, very committed, can also be very, very unkind and sometimes even vicious in practicing their faith. Origen had it that this means that love is sweet to all. There was no more religious a man than Philip II of Spain, and yet that same Philip of Spain founded the Spanish Inquisition and thought he was serving God by massacring those who thought differently from him. The famous Cardinal Pole declared that murder and adultery could not compare in heinousness with heresy. Apart altogether from that persecuting spirit, there is in so many good people an attitude of criticism. So many good church people would have sided with the rulers and not with Jesus if they had had to deal with the woman taken in adultery. Paul says Christians have to practice a sweet kind of love. Love knows no envy. Now, you know what? There's two different kinds of envy. The first one, I would dare say, is one that we're guilty of, every one of us. That's coveting the possessions of other people. Well, that's a very human thing.
I want
I don't
Pat
think any of us should be
Zetterberg.
too ashamed of that. I mean, we're all normal humans. We all do that. We all covet the possessions of other people.
It takes premium.
But the second kind of envy is a whole lot worse, because it begrudges others for having what you don't. Okay? Wishing that they had never gotten the things that they got. Now that's mean. That's really bad. And Paul says Christians who act in love don't do that. Love is no braggart. You know, you think about it, true love is really self-effacing. True love has a self-effacing quality about it. Always being a lot more impressed with its own unworthiness than it is with its own merit. Okay? In other words, a real lover cannot ever get over the wonder that they are loved. It believes it can never offer the loved one a gift that is good enough. And that's the thing about love is not a braggart. Love is very, very self-effacing. Paul goes on to say love is not inflated with its own importance. Carey, who began life as a cobbler, was one of the greatest missionaries and certainly one of the greatest linguists the world has ever seen. He translated at least parts of the Bible into no fewer than 34 different Indian languages. When he came to India, he was regarded with dislike and contempt. At a dinner party, a snob, with the idea of humiliating him, said in a tone that everyone could hear, "I suppose, Mr. Carey, you once worked as a shoemaker." "No, your lordship," answered Carey, "not a shoemaker, just a cobbler." He didn't even claim to make shoes, only to mend them. That's what we mean by love is not inflated with its own importance. Love is humble. Love does not behave gracelessly. The Greek word Paul used here for grace has the same meaning as charm. We're all aware of Christians who exist who actually take delight in being very blunt and insensitive, you know, as if I am the possessor of truth. I'm going to spell it out for you, and if you don't like it, too bad. That's the way it is. You know, that kind of a blunt, uncaring kind of a insensitivity. Real love, Paul means to say, never forgets that courtesy and tact and politeness are lovely things. Love does not insist on its rights. Now, if you think about it, there are basically two different kinds of people. There are those who are always focused upon their rights and privileges. They're the ones that are always thinking about what life owes them. And boy, I hate to tell you this is a rampant disease in our great country of America. And then there's another group of people who always seem to be focused in remembering their responsibilities, who never forget what they owe to life. Paul says, love insists that we think less of our rights and more of our duties. Love never flies into a temper. The real meaning here is that Christian love never becomes exasperated with people, with the other person. Because exasperation spells defeat. And temper, well, once you lose your temper, you lose. Even to the extent that when a person is hated, they do not give way to hating. But we're going right along here, folks. You all finding out how easy it is to be a Christian and love people?
Oh, yeah, impossible.
Yeah.
Boy, I tell you, it's a doozy. Love does not store up the memory of wrongs received. And the Greek word that Paul uses here, logaishathai, is actually a word used by accountants, people who kept books. It's a word used for entering up an item in a ledger in a way so that it will never be forgotten. Okay, that's the meaning behind the word Paul uses here. In Polynesia, where the natives spend much of their time in fighting and feasting, it is customary for each man to keep some reminders of his hatred. Articles are suspended from the roofs of their huts to keep alive the memory of the wrongs, real or imaginary. And in the same way, many people nurse their wrath to keep it warm. They brood over those wrongs until it's impossible to forget them. I hate to tell you this. Paul says Christian love learns the great lesson of forgetting. I got a long way to go to be a Christian lover. Love finds no pleasure in evildoing. There's a better translation. Love finds no joy in doing anything that is wrong. It pertains to a person who receives malicious pleasure when they hear derogatory gossip about somebody else, preferring to hear of the misfortune of others rather than the good fortune. Christian love does not find pleasure in ill reports. Love rejoices with the truth. I'll tell you what, guys, this is one of the toughest ones of all, I think. This is not as easy as it sounds. I mean, we all are in favor of the truth, right? We all support the truth. There are times in life when we do not want the truth to prevail. There are even times when the truth is the one thing we least want to hear. Right? Mm-hmm. You know, if you have nothing to conceal, then you have no problem being happy with the truth. So if there is a truth that you do not want to hear, then you must have something you're hiding that you don't want anybody to know about. So Paul says, love rejoices with the truth. Love can endure anything, Paul says. Love can bear any insult, any injury, any disappointment. Love can handle it.
Will you read that again?
Yes. Thy foes might hate despise, revile. Thy friends unfaithful prove, unwearied in forgiveness still, thy heart could only love. Love is completely trusting, Paul says. It means always thinking and believing the best about other people. We always think the worst, don't we? Do we ignore the bad traits that people have and only focus on their good traits?
I think people do. I don't.
We
I think
try.
we do. We try.
We
yeah.
try. It is a fact of life that we often make people what we believe them to be. Okay? You show somebody that you don't trust them, guess what? They become untrustworthy. Okay? When Arnold became headmaster of rugby, he instituted a completely new way of doing things. Before him, school had been a terror and a tyranny. Arnold called the boys together and told them that there was going to be much more liberty and much less flogging. You are free, he said, but you are responsible. You are gentlemen. I intend to leave you much to yourselves and put upon you your honor, because I believe that if you are guarded and watched and spied upon, you will grow up knowing only the fruits of servile fear. And when your liberty is finally given you, as it must be someday, you will not know how to use it. The boys found it difficult to believe. When they were brought before him, they continued to make the old excuses and to tell the same old lies. Boys, he said, if you say so, it must be true. I believe your word. The result was that there came a time in rugby when boys said, it's a real shame to tell Arnold a lie. He always believes you. He believed in them, and he made them what he believed them to be. Love can ennoble even the ignoble by believing the best. That's Paul's point. Love never ceases to hope, believing that no person is hopeless. Pretty hard for me to believe. I've known some pretty hopeless people. I'm sorry. Adam Clarke was one of the great theologians, but at school he was very slow to learn. Well, one day a distinguished visitor paid a visit to the school, and the teacher singled out Adam Clarke, and he said, "That is the stupidest boy in the school." Before he left the school, the visitor came to the boy and said kindly, "Never mind, my boy. You may be a great scholar someday. Don't be discouraged, but try hard and keep on trying." The teacher was hopeless. The visitor was hopeful, and who knows? It may well have been that word of hope which made Adam Clarke what he one day became. Finally, Paul says,
Who was Adam Clarke?
I have
Do we
no
know him?
idea.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was thinking that same thing.
He was the stupidest boy in school.
Oh.
Love bears all with triumphant fortitude. The Greek word here, hupopenine, it really means the spirit in a person which can rise up to the challenge to conquer and transmute things. It does not mean passively bearing all things. See, when we normally hear triumphant fortitude, we're thinking of a person sitting there and just toughing it out, grinning and bearing it and biting their lip and passively, no, that's not what Paul means. Paul says it's the spirit in a person which brings them to conquer and transmute all things and change all things. Okay, almost through here. Paul comes to the last part of this chapter. After he's said all this, he says, love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. He says, when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now we see by a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Paul says three things in that passage. The first thing he says, love is absolutely permanent. It never ends. When all the things that man glories in have passed away, there's only one thing that will be left that will remain. That'll be love. Love is unconquerable. The assaults of time, Paul says, are helpless when love exists, and love even transcends death. Love is permanent. Second, Paul says, love gives absolute completeness. Paul believes that in this life, we can only see imperfect reflections of God. Even if Christ offers us a perfect reflection of God, it's still a mystery because our faulty minds can only perceive that reflection in part. But the way of love will lead us to the day when the haze and the fog is cleared away, and we will see with absolute clarity the reality of God. Paul says that day could never happen without love. Why? Because God is love. And only the person who loves will be able to see God as he is. And so finally Paul says love is also absolutely supreme. Faith and hope are great. Don't cast them aside. You need them. But love is greater still. Faith without love is cold. Hope without love is grim. Love is the fire which kindles faith and turns hope into certainty. So, sometimes we fall a little short and end up with inaccurate and distorted concepts about things. Perhaps up until this point, there have been things in that 13th chapter that were a little confusing to you. You didn't quite get the reality of what Paul was talking about. And what Paul is really communicating here in that chapter is exactly the same thing that Jesus said over and over and over. Love is the key. Love is the secret. Love is the answer. Love is the one thing that is always right. And so Paul would say Christian love is spiritual maturity. The authentic sign of true discipleship is Christian love. The most dramatic sign of God's powerful presence in our lives is love. I'll sum the whole lesson up for you in one short phrase.
Yeah, Joyce needs it.
There's the whole ball of wax for you, girl.
My timing was perfect.
Yes, it was. If you miss love, you miss God. That's it.
Amen. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
it was very
Brian.
good.
Yeah.
Really good.
Brian, I'm so sorry I haven't been here
Well, why should you be
at all
sorry?
for myself.